Um, I'm Garry Hynes. I'm Artistic Director of Druid Galway.
Hi, Gary. Thanks a million for joining us on the Access Chats. Gary, can I ask you, looking back on your life and career, do you think you were always destined to become a stage director, like as a young girl? Was it something that you kind of was it a life in the arts for you? Do you think?
Um, no, I mean, there's nothing about my background um, or growing up or anything like that that would seem to suggest at all that I was going to have a career in the theatre, never mind such a lengthy one. I mean, I do look sometimes at the name Druid, and I kind of find it hard to believe that, you know, this organization, this history has emerged out of something that I've been involved with from the very beginning. So it's I'm as much subject to it as a notion as have been part of it.
That's gas because it kind of something that I mean it's kind of amazing for us looking at from the outside in at Druid throughout the many years. But I'd say it must be extraordinary for you. Obviously, I can imagine like in your postgrad years, kind of with your friends around you wanting to develop work, and now you find yourself so many years later still in that same space.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I do with theatre studies with NUIG, and I'm back up in some of the rooms talking to people about theatre. It seems only a few days after I left the place myself. It's just hard to believe that so much has happened in the meantime.
Yeah.
So I think that I think there was no guarantee that Druid was going to succeed from the beginning. I think there was no imagination on any of our parts that it was going to exist beyond a couple of months or a couple of years. Looking back now, you can sort of you can see some of the reasons why it did, but they wouldn't have been clear at all to any of us at the time.
And were you before that time, or were you a reader? Were you was kind of theatre, even though it wasn't in your family? Was it kind of in your surrounds? Or was it through literature that you kind of got your inputs as a young girl?
I would say it was through literature. I've been a sort of avid reader since I was very young. I can actually remember wanting to read even before I could read.
Wow.
But there was something also to do with theatre, because again, looking back on it, when I was in fifth class in the Louis Convent in Monaghan, for some reason or other, I produced a play. And then sort of became involved with a small bit of drama that was done in the Dominican College in Galway. And immediately I went into university, joined Dramasoc.
Okay.
I wasn't sitting there thinking, I love the theatre, I have to do theatre. I hadn't even seen very much of it at that time. But something was drawing me towards it, even if I can only see that in retrospect.
Yeah, yeah. And was there any kind of, looking back on that now, are kind of types of books you were kind of drawn to within that sphere? Was there kind of particular areas that you were kind of interested in?
Not really. For a start, I wasn't a brilliant fiction reader as a child, like Enid Blyton, but not so much as I grew older. I was more a reader of history and fact, and also a terribly indiscriminate reader. I read everything, and there. I don't think there's anything that you could find from my. I wasn't reading books about theatre or books about people in the theatre, or
Yeah, and then
nothing like that.
And then when you hit, when you went into NUIG, and when that kind of start, like, what was the impetus? What was for you? What was the impetus towards kind of making work?
I just, it's something that I sort of got into. As I said, I joined Dramasoc. We went to our first meeting. They divided up the room into freshers into people who wanted to direct and people who wanted to act. I absolutely knew that I didn't want to act, that I couldn't act, and directing I wasn't clear quite what that was, but it sounded more interesting. They suggested various plays, one-act plays, for us to direct. I read the one that was suggested for me. I didn't like it, but I had got sort of drawn in at this stage. I went to the library and I pulled out a play called The Loves of Castmaguire by Brian Friel. I read it. I was absolutely blown away by it, and cast a sort of 18-year-old Marie Mullinan in the part of the elderly Castmaguire, and we went on from there.
And I mean, when you say, because obviously, the history is well read and the way Druid kind of developed, but I'm interested in those moments, kind of like, when you started getting into the room, or when you started kind of working with Marie, when you start, like, did you even notice then kind of something was kind of for you, as not knowing what a director was there something that kind of felt a bit different for you, or was it just?
No, not really. I mean, I do think there was one thing, all right, in the sense that I was a person always of fads, and so when I was at school, I'd get terribly interested in the law for 6 months, and then terribly interested in something else. But I never had a faithful relationship with anything.
Yeah.
And then about 2 or 3 years into college, when I was still doing theatre, I thought, oh, I do remember clearly thinking, I'm not enjoying this as much as I did the first time, but I'm still doing it. So maybe there's something there. That was the only faint thought I had.
So basically, the last 45 years has been you trying to get rid of the fad.
Yeah, yeah, more or less. I mean, for years I thought, I'll give up soon and get a proper job and
was there ever an alternative kind of career path? Was there ever something in your head that?
Well, the alternative career path for anybody doing a BA HDip degree in the 70s was a teacher. And my father was a teacher and a passionate educationalist. So that was the job that was waiting for me when I stopped this rubbish. Yeah. I think that I probably thought that, I might get employed in some ways, that I might do television or film, or I would do something. I did consider those things, but nothing ever materialized.
And then the idea of, I mean, it's one thing kind of, doing a freshers play and like, but as that kind of, when did the idea of like a company or the idea of that kind of collaborative space, or like, was that over a course of a number of years, or was it?
No, it was right from the beginning.
Right. Okay.
I mean, in 1975, when I was supposed to be doing a HDip, the Dramsoc in UCG, as it was then, we were touring the play around the various festivals, and in June 1975 we started rehearsing for a season of plays in the Jesuit Hall in Galway under the name of Druid, 3 plays which opened on consecutive days, one after the other, in July of 75. Okay. So from the very beginning, it was about a company. Okay. And from the very beginning, there was a pretty fundamental idea about ensemble, because obviously Marie and I found theatre together. I mean, it's odd now really, because I actually had to sit the Leaving Cert over 3 years because I didn't matriculate the first year round. And if so, I wouldn't have been in first year in college at the same time as Marie. We probably wouldn't even have spoken to each other.
Wow.
But I did have a sense of that. And then working with other people like Sean McGinley, and then in the early years of Druid with Mick. But the relationship with Mick started with the starting of Druid.
Okay.
And so therefore, working with a bunch of people and sharing a set of ideas and sharing a set of collaborations together was very much part of it all along.
And were those ideas kind of bashed out? I mean, like, was there a sense of one vision? Like, were those ideas kind of honed between you, or was it kind of, no, we all know why we're doing this?
Oh no, I think they were honed between us in the sense that, but they were done by talking, like for instance, a number of things. For instance, we in the early years, you said we want to do plays that people haven't seen before. And so if a play was a hit in Dublin, even the degree that we were aware of Dublin or professional theatre, that wouldn't mean that we would do it. Then a lot of people said, well, you're a culture, you're a rural theatre company, so you must be doing John B. Keane. And we said, no, we're not doing John B. Keane. And of course, they therefore didn't get around to doing works of that brilliant writer until the late 80s.
Yeah. And in relation to kind of very, it's always interested me, the name then, where did that kind of come from?
It came from the Asterix and the Gaul, the French comic strip, and it was running in the back of the Times, at the Irish Times at the time. And essentially, there was a lot of names between us. There was a group of about 10 to 15 people involved at this stage. And we threw a lot of names around. And finally, we had to come up with a name because we were getting a bank loan. Okay. And therefore, it had to have a name. And just saw the Druid. Yeah. And knowing that Druids were Celtic pagan priests. So we said, well, we'll call ourselves Druid for the moment, and we'll get a better name after a few months, and we'll change it.
There you go. And those first 16 kind of, those first, well, I suppose not just kind of 16 years, but those first years, I suppose, yeah. You seem to have set your stall out very, very quickly in relation to, I mean, it's funny talking to you now after finishing your Druid Gregory, and, yeah. It kind of nearly maps back in relation to your work touring, from the very beginning, and from fairly early on touring internationally as well. And that seems to be that kind of local, national and international piece seems to be a fundamental thing to Druid. And that was there from the beginning, yeah?
I think that was there from the beginning for purely practical reasons as well, because quite simply, we were rooted in Galway. There was no way, even if we'd wanted to, we could sustain a year-round or even a 6 or 9 month operation. So therefore, in order to sustain people, we had to find audiences beyond Galway. From our experience, myself and Marie, on the touring circuit, and from our sort of background in the west of Ireland, we knew that there were audiences out there in places like Claremorris and Loughrea, Tuam, Athlone, whatever. And so it became a natural thing to go there. And then if there's audiences out there, why not look across the water and internationally tour? So it was kind of really built into the DNA of the company almost from the beginning, I would say.
Because, I mean, like Galway, like Ireland was a very different nation back in those times, and however Dublin-centric things can be viewed now, they certainly were Dublin-centric, not just in culture, but like Galway was a very different place back then.
Yeah, Galway was a very different place, although it had a kind of certain sort of what I would call it a vivacity and energy, which was effectively provided by the fact that at that time, there up to 3,000, 4,000 young people descended on the city every September, and kind of, affected the life of the city. And it's interesting to see around that time, like Druid was 75, then Macnas Galway Arts Festival, all those things all came out around the same time. So yeah. I think, and I think one of the things that drives, if you look at what we're very different from Macnas, or obviously from the Galway Arts Festival, but there's a kind of a passionate love of the West and a passionate love of Galway that is at the core of all of us.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what's it's so brilliant and so kind of true, I suppose, in a lot of ways, where the more individual and the more local things are, the more international and universal actually are by de facto, rather than trying to make things international. Can you talk a bit about the early years then, and when kind of things started to shift for you? Do you know what I mean? What was there kind of, I mean, obviously, we'd be here all night if people went kind of play by play, but just in relation to when did you kind of go, oh, okay, this is something different now from trying things out, and was there a moment in time, or are there moments in time looking back that you kind of go, that was a step for us?
No, I mean, I can. I've often said that kind of the history of Druid could be written through the history of the various ensembles that formed, did cycles of work for a period of time and then sort of dispersed. And the first ensemble would be the 5, 6, 7 grouping of 8 people, who were really there on and off from 1975 to about 1979, 80. And then by the time 1980 came, we had taken a lease on Druid Lane. The early members of the company had gone off to do other things, and people were coming from Dublin who were looking to make a life for themselves in the professions. We were effectively professionalizing in the late 70s, early 80s. And by 82, 83, I think would have had reason to call ourselves a professional organization.
Yeah. And was that a shift for you personally as well? I mean, you know, because being a director in a rehearsal room is a different thing from being a director of, you know, an artistic director of a company. And then if you add a building onto that, things shift, you know, different. And was that something for you to happen kind of gradually, or was it kind of that was there a plan there to kind of do that?
No, I mean, there wasn't a plan there in the sense it did happen gradually. I mean, but it always happened for practical reasons. So the first shows that we did were done in the Jesuit Hall. We had to rehearse from midnight to 5 o'clock in the morning because the hall wasn't available at any other time.
Wow.
So that made us say we need a place of our own. So we found this function room at the back of a hotel. Then we need somewhere bigger. So we found Druid Lane. Everything happened, you know, in about a year or 2 years in the planning. And really, in a sense, no, I mean, what brings me into the rehearsal room now is the same thing that brought me into the rehearsal room and back in the early years. I mean, it really hasn't changed. I mean, you know, working with, well, one of the changes that marks any director, I think, is working with established professional actors as opposed to your colleagues who are your own age. That does mark a difference. You know, realizing that there are you know, there's structures and forms like the formality of a rehearsal room, you know, having stage management staff, all of those kind of things were things that grew gradually as the company grew. But the spirit of the rehearsal room really hasn't changed. It's the same for me now as it was back then.
And back then, Garry, in relation to you saying, you know, when you were kind of went to one side of the room or the other in relation to freshers, you know, that sense of you discovering what was the director for you, or you discovering what, you know, like, is there a moment, like, obviously there are playwrights that have been kind of with you, you know, in and out through your career, and companies and collaborators. But in those moments of, say, with you and the play, reading it, or you in a draft, or you in an idea, like, when you say that you remember that feeling kind of back, you know, back in the early days, you really feel that connection is still there in the same way? Do you know what I mean? Or has that radically changed for you in the operational piece? No,
I mean, the only thing, I mean, I'm really not almost not being facetious. I mean, the only thing you get as you grow older is you begin to know more and more precisely how exactly things can go wrong in your early days. But really, it's the same. And I suppose because I was sort of working with people I knew and that I had been working with for 4 years in college, the idea of thinking collaboratively was at the heart of what I did. So I would be reading a play almost from the beginning, seeing certain people in it and identifying and connecting with the play through other people rather than making a judgment on this as some sort of an intellectual process.
Okay. And would you, you know, because this is every play, but then is kind of hearing it important to you at a very early stage?
Really, really important. Yeah, absolutely, really important. I always, you know, say there are 3 times you hear a play crystal clear. The first time is when you actually read it. The second time is when you hear it read by actors for the first time. And the next time is when you hear it performed in front of an audience for the first time. Those are the 3 crystal clear moments in the rehearsal room. Everything else is fog.
Yeah. It's brilliantly put. And I think in relation to those kind of, you know, that journey between, like I just say, it's fascinating actually just reflecting what you're saying about linking it to kind of the collaborators or the key collaborators in any kind of one era. but also then you kind of put into that writers as well, you know,
Yeah.
and in a way living and dead, because, you know, there's,
Yeah.
and I suppose when you talk about Drew and you talk about Galway, you talk about the love of the West, you know, there is, you know, singing has played a big part throughout their whole work. And can you just talk about that for a minute in relation to kind of what you keep finding in that well?
Well, I mean, in terms of singing, we literally, you know, kind of did play by the Western world, because we were doing plays in the summer, and in Galway, the tourists came in, and Playboy was one of the few plays we'd probably heard of. And then it genuinely was an epiphany in the rehearsal room, where myself and Mick and Marie and others turned around and said, you know, this play isn't a load of, you know, old kind of whatever we thought it was. This play is there's something absolutely fascinating about it. So it was really a kind of a process of all of us falling in love with singing as a writer, and saying to ourselves, absolutely, then, that if we last it would be great to do this again and try and do it right the next time. So, and I turn out spending the rest of my life trying to do that very same thing.
There's a great mantra for a company.
Absolutely, yeah. Keep trying.
But also there's kind of, you know, and again, it's not the right phrase, but there's a kind of, I mean, I spend an awful lot of time down the West myself, and there's kind of, you know, as from an Irish kind of point of view, there's a certain kind of, I guess the wrong phrase, but the best I can find, that kind of magic realist kind of, you know, space to it. And I think that kind of threads through an awful lot of your work. And I don't mean that in any kind of wishy-washy kind of way, but that kind of sense of what's behind the language. And I think that's what's really fascinating, kind of, if you look at it from Druid Shakespeare, you know, right back to sing and see the lineage, and not fascinatingly by anything you're putting on top of it, but by actually what you're kind of extracting from it. I think that's what's always fascinated me about looking at your work, is that kind of, that extraction. I mean, that it's kind of, it seems to me that it's about that, rather than any sense of auteurism or anything like that, you know.
Oh, no, very much so. I mean, I really do genuinely feel, you know, that my job is, to a large extent, to try and get out of the way of the play, and to try and get out of the way of the actors. And, you know, and I'm not being particularly humble by saying that, I don't want to sound like that, but, you know, I can see how I can, to coin a phrase, I can see and have seen how I can fuck it up.
Yeah.
Whereas the connection between the actor, the language, the writer, the ideas, and the audience, when that happens in a really good way, it's very special. And you're aware of it. And so once you get a smell of it, you know that's what you have to keep looking for again. And if you know, I mean, I always use this terribly cliched old phrase, but, you know, I remember it sticking in my head right from the very beginning. If you want to send a message, use Western Union. So the idea that you would take a play to communicate something else, that you would want to communicate something and then find a play that did that, it just doesn't make sense to me. It never has.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to find is what's in that thing itself.
Yeah.
That makes the magic. How do you do that?
Have you ever been, not turned, but has it ever turned fundamentally for you by what you found on the way? Do you know what I mean? Is it kind of like have you ever been shocked by what you found?
Oh yeah, always. But that's what's lovely about it. I mean, you know, I mean, and it does turn badly as well. I mean, you can go into a first reading and know you have miscast. And, you know, I always say, finally, it's the director's responsibility, because, you know, the director made the decision to cast an actor in it. And, you know, and those magic performances, like, you know, somebody like Siobhan McKenna in Ballymun on the first night of that. I mean, you are beside that. You're watching it, but you are not it. I am not on the stage.
Yeah. I mean that, you know, as in relation to kind of seminal kind of pieces of work, that, is talked about in those. But I'm interested in relation to, say, that letting it go for yourself is, at what point as a director, as you say about the 3 moments where you hear a play, Crystal, but in relation to your role as a director, has that changed for you in relation to where you kind of pull away from things? Because I say it must be difficult in relation to, say, doing trilogies or doing festivals or doing,
Well, yeah, you have to stay on it. You know what I mean? Like when you turn around and decide to do, 6 hours of Shakespeare, it means you're going to have to sit through 3, 4, 5 previews of 6 hours of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
But I generally, I know there are directors and who stay part of, and particularly in ensembles, who stay part of the process long after its opening night. I'm really not one of them. For me, as soon as it starts to go in front of an audience, I can hear the cast beginning to pay attention to another point of light in the room, because audiences, actors' response to audiences is immutable. I mean, it's amazing the way you see that you're trying to explain a note to an actor and somehow or other you have not explained it successfully, and then you go and see it in front of an audience and think, how did they understand that? And they do understand it because they're just listening to the audience, and they instinctively understand it. It's also what talent is.
But for you as well, I mean, as a director, like for you to have that relationship with the actor as the audience before the audience even gets, because there has to be an actual sense with you of I suppose, manifold ways of an audience might respond to any given moment. And I suppose, do you take your, outside the rehearsal rooms, do you take your ideas for a walk? Do you, is there, when you're kind of mulling, what's your process out of the room?
Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do. I mean, you're working, you're working in the room, and that's obviously where the real cold-face work goes on.
Yeah.
But then you're out and you're like walking into rehearsal, you're doing something else, you're not possibly even thinking about it, and suddenly kind of, and something connects. I mean, when you're involved in the production of a play, it's always there,
Yeah.
And it's as I said, you cannot prescribe it. I think this is one of not the dilemmas, but one of the issues for all directors. Like if you try and over prescribe it, if you try and make it be something in a fixed way, it will fly away from you so quick. And so that's always the balance, really, is trying to nurture what is actually in there rather than impose something from outside, and you're not even sure the difference.
Yeah. When was the first time what was the first thing you brought in internationally in those days?
I think it would probably have been both Playboy, the second production of Playboy, the one that went on through the 80s. Playboy and Conversations on a Homecoming. Went to London and eventually to New York.
Yeah, I mean that play, it's one of my favorite pieces of work, and I think it's funny watching it in different eras, and the resonances that it has. But can you talk a bit about that play in particular?
Conversations.
Yeah.
Well, Conversations kind of, again, it was something that snuck up on us. I mean, we started in the early 80s, we started to know that we needed to be doing new plays. But the kind of work that was coming into us was not something that we found particularly interesting. And Tom, I sort of have begun slightly to know Tom, and Tom was from Tune. And I just, as I began to know him, we approached him and said, would you work with us for a period of time? And would you come writer in residence? I think we asked him to be. And he, I think at that time, He had left Tuam and gone to England very early, and then come back to Dublin. But he saw something for himself that he could actually make theatre, but in Galway.
Yeah.
And so there was something there for both of us. And out of that relationship came, he would write a new play for us. We would do an existing play of his, which was Famine. And then I asked him at one point, was there any play that he had done before that he would like to, my naivety in asking the question at the time, was there anything that he would like to try again that he felt he hadn't got right the first time around? And he started to talk about a play called The White House, in which he had two separate acts, Conversations on a Homecoming and Speeches of Farewell. And he never knew which should be the first act and which should be the second act. And I said, well, can we start talking about that and doing, and then over a period of time we did. And suddenly the answer seemed to be clear, was that in fact, Speeches of Farewell was almost redundant. Right. And that with some changing of the writing in the first part of Conversations on a Homecoming, it was a play in itself. And Tom was very nervous about it. And you can see the evidence of that in the poster, because the original poster for the production says Conversations on a Homecoming, and in brackets afterwards, The White House by Tom Murphy. I mean, he felt too nervous even to conclusively give it a new title.
Wow. And for you then, like, obviously as one of your, successes is a wrong word, and it's whatever, yeah. as one of the both relationships and obviously plays that kind of set you kind of on a different road, but also the fact that you've kind of come back to it. I think that this the sense that kind of that's, because I remember, it's funny that play, I remember seeing it, a student production of it in I think Galway did it in 1993 or something, and it was all going wrong, and then something happened in the middle of it. Yeah, and it just kind of went into this whole other space. You kind of go, oh Jesus, they kind of found it by accident, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, but I suppose for you, say something the same happened to us.
But was there a moment through that rehearsal process that you kind of, is that the way it kind of worked for you? Kind of going, there's.
Well, I do know that in the course, I remember two things specifically about it, that when Tom and I started discussing the production of it, we obviously talked about casting, and we agreed on the casting fairly quickly. And then, as is his wont, he came back to me like maybe just before we started rehearsal or something and said, I think we've got the cast all wrong. I think it should be. And I went, what? And I nearly pass out in panic. And I said, no. And I mean, I was terrified of him at the time. I was always terrified of him. And I said, I don't think so. I think we should stay the way we are. And he agreed, and we did. And somehow or other, the original actors owned those roles so much that Tom and I often talked afterwards that we even had that conversation.
Yes.
I think the second thing was, we were rehearsing it on tour. We were touring something else at the time. And I remember doing a run of it about 3 weeks into rehearsal and thinking it was a mess. And we were going down with all hands unless we applied some sort of absolute discipline to this in terms of pace, accuracy of lines, which Tom was always passionate about, and all. And remember, turned around and we just worked so hard in that final week. And I think the play really did actually make its jump from being an absolute mess to something rather good in that last week.
Yeah. And then
production, I mean, the play was always good.
Yeah. But and then, like, I suppose having I suppose happened for a lot of work, having that kind of very the Galway kind of audiences first, and then something that kind of expands. Like, how I'm particularly saying with Conversations, when you started to tour Tom Murphy's work, how is that for you as a director, watching it in front of different audiences in the early days as a kind of company?
You know, it's the thing I say, because people ask me about it as well in terms of working, say, in New York or working in Ireland. It really, the process is so similar all the time. And, you know, I mean, you could distinguish sometimes where there was a local joke or not, or the fact that our Galway audiences, we hadn't well trained as we went along. So, you know, they would get things quicker than other audiences and so on. But really, you know, um, they were never any different. The event of the performances was and still is a bit different in the sense that, you know, when you go into the smaller communities, you're touring to the smaller community, it tends to be an event within the community itself. So you tend to, for instance, get a wide cross section of ages in a way that you don't quite get in established theatres and cities and so on. And so there was that kind of sort of magic about it. But it's the event that differs. The eventual kind of transmission of the play doesn't change that much.
Yeah. And then tell me about Mr. Keane and finding, as you said, like, you know, finding John B. Because as we said at the beginning, we're not going to have time to kind of go through everything. So I am going to be leaving details, so apologies. But I'm fascinated by, say, his arrival into your kind of canon, let's say, or, you know, was it, how did that come about for you?
Well, it came about by I was asked by the Abbey to direct a production of, no, I'm going to blank. But I did that production, and really that was what kind of jump started me into doing Keane. In fact, this would be even before, I mean, before I actually became artistic director of the Abbey. I think I did this. I can't remember dates anymore, but it was only at that time, really only in the late 80s that we began to do Keane and find something, you know, I mean, like, you know, he's occupied such an extraordinary position and it still does to some extent, but did then very much so. I mean, he was just such a hugely popular writer.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when I was in the Abbey doing a quick set of sums for myself and actually sort of taking out the last 3 productions of Keane out of the box office average of the Abbey over a period of 3 or 5 years, and finding like it dropped 20 or 25%. For Druid, the shows always filled. The shows filled the Gaiety. They were constantly on the amateur circuit. I mean, as a writer, he occupied a place of extraordinarily popular faith over generations.
Yeah.
I mean, people used to say, oh yeah, Keane was popular with the last generation, but that has continued for the 3 generations I've seen through of him. I don't know whether it will in the strange new world that's coming about now, but
I think the thing,
and I often wonder about that, is that John B didn't have a professional career, and you know, and in fact, the great premiere of his first play, Sive, was an amateur production that became very famous. And I think something of that strange relationship he had to his audiences that you can only have in an amateur context stayed with him as a writer.
That's very interesting. Yeah, but I think his themes were as writ large as Shakespeare. You know, as a Shakespeare that you would have gone on to do. You know that. And talk to me then. I mean, you kind of, what was it like? Do you remember what the first time you worked outside of Druid was, Gary? Was there?
I think it must have been for the Abbey.
Yeah. And was that a very...
in fact, I do know, I remember now, it was for the Abbey, and it was with production of, I did a production of Whistle in the Dark.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that was the first significant thing I did outside. And yeah.
I mean, again, that must have been a very different experience, you know, if we have kind of...
Very, 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 very different. And it was Christopher Fitzsimon, who was artistic director at the time. And he invited me and suggested the play, Whistle in the Dark, and also suggested Godfrey Quigley for the lead. And I wouldn't have dreamt of approaching somebody like Godfrey. So he put the elements of the production together, and yeah, it was.
And when you're looking around,
It was a very different experience. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And I said, but I suppose you've done a lot of that kind of now over the preceding kind of time, and obviously you went on to spend your years there as artistic director. But that kind of building of collaborators, you know, it's as a jobbing director, you're kind of doing that on the hoof, you know, whatever, 4 or 5 times a year if you're lucky.
Yeah.
But when you have your company, I just say you're kind of building that in kind of strands.
Yeah.
So was there a sense of kind of not I don't mean testing yourself, but kind of exploring yourself in a different environment by working outside that kind of comfort zone as well?
Oh, sure, absolutely. I mean, you know, and you know that was absolutely part of my thinking in leaving Druid as well, because you know I wasn't sure that I knew whether I could direct outside Druid, and you know, which needed each other more. Did Druid need me more than I needed Druid, or whatever? And at a certain point, those questions sort of had to be answered.
Yeah.
And in a curious way, I think only by leaving Druid could I have come back and now had what appears to be a lifetime career with which is very, very unusual. And I feel very fortunate. I'm not convinced. In fact, I'm absolutely convinced of the other, which is that if I had to make a career as a jobbing director like my colleagues, I'm not sure I would have survived in the theatre.
Yeah. And also, was it true at the time that, like, you know, it was, there wasn't a massive intention for you to come back? Like, it was...
there was no intention, genuinely. Absolutely none. And because, you know, I can remember emptying out, we had offices in another building, and all my books that I'd accumulated over time were there. And I remember it was a Christmas that I just, you know, took those all out of the office. Nobody else was around there. I mean, I remember feeling extraordinarily lonely because I knew effectively ending one period of my life, and I never intended to come back.
Yeah.
And then I did 3 years in the Abbey, and Melissa, who was my successor, did 3 years here. And the Druid board at the time had difficulty appointing the successor to Melissa, and asked me to come back temporarily. I was even called consultant artistic director for, you know, 6 months, a year, just to give them more time. And I did, and they haven't got rid of me since.
Great consultancy.
Yeah, absolutely. I was still being called consultant artistic director about 3 years later. I remember going to the chairman, James O'Grady at the time, saying that maybe it's about time we drop this consultant bit.
And I suppose, I mean, you know, a great honour also to direct not just direct at the National Theatre, but be the director, the artist director of the National Theatre, and at a fairly young age as well. You know what I mean? That was kind of at a time when there was a lot happening in theatre as well, you know, in Ireland, and you know. And also, that's a very different beast to what you had. But through that time, as well, there was work that you created that was, you know, great and challenging and kind of. And did you feel, was there a freedom? Was there a bizarre freedom in that for you, in a way, kind of, or was it the opposite?
No, I wouldn't call it freedom, but there was a huge learning experience. I mean, it was hugely challenging, and you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, going from running a small company of kind of co-equals that you'd founded yourself into running effectively, and I'm not using the word in a derogatory manner, an institution, because that is what the Abbey is, a building with 2 theatres, a staff of 100 plus. I mean, there's just no comparison between the 2 events. And you know, I actually probably grew up in a way in those 3 years in a way that I wouldn't have done had I not been fortunate enough to be there. And I certainly came out a different person than the one I went in. And
then in your consultancy years, then along comes Martin McDonagh and his work.
Yeah.
And you know, and therefore starts another kind of, in a way, from the outside looking in, you know, a kind of trajectory that just went nuclear, in a lot of ways, and found you on stages in Broadway receiving Tony Awards, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Talk to me about the beginning of that, of that relationship for a minute, will you?
It's very simple, basically. When I originally came back to Druid, I asked to see what plays were coming in. Was there a difference between the plays I had been reading a year previously in the Abbey and the stuff coming into Druid? And up popped this play called Skull and Connemara at the time. And I read it and I was really impressed. And I remember saying, has this guy sent in any other plays and who is he? And he had sent in one other play and he lived in London. So I got in touch with them and went to London to meet him about 2 weeks later and said to him, we'd like to produce your plays, and not only would we like to do one of them, but I'd like to option all three. He had 3 plays in various stages of development, all 3 of those plays. And then the question came, which of them to do first? And eventually the decision came, probably because of availability of casting, to do Beauty Queen first. And, you know, then suddenly this bandwagon started running and went on for the next 10 years. And
what was that? I mean, like, the minute you kind of step onto that, you know, Travelator, what?
Yeah.
Like what, you know, as I said, that the crystal clearness of kind of reading a play and then hearing it read, and then, but was it very soon that you knew, kind of in rehearsal rooms, you kind of go, this is different. This is kind of something new.
No, I don't think you knew anything for certain, but you did have the play looked very strange and sounded very strange. I mean, who on earth, you know, was writing plays set, you know, in the 1990s, set in country cottages with crucifixes in the background and all women tormenting their middle-aged daughters? I mean, you don't write those kind of plays anymore. And so, but it became clear, I think, early on the rehearsal that the play as a play really worked. That there was a huge kind of dramaturgical skill there. And then the question began for me, certainly, about how to make it work in a way that the audience would take it, I don't mean seriously, but take it for what it was rather than take it as some sort of
pastiche.
Yeah, pastiche, exactly. Yeah, and that very much became the question. So I think we did know that if we got it right, it could be very popular.
Yeah.
But you didn't know whether you had got it right until I do remember the first preview and the audience response. And I remember thinking, that's good.
Where was the first preview of that?
It was the opening play of the new Town Hall Theatre.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So, and I remember people thinking at the time, saying at the time, you know, a 300, 400 seater theatre, surely you're not doing a new play. And I said, well, if you're going to open a new theatre, you should open it with a new play. But it was a very particular new play, and it, you know, it was a play that we sort of knew if we could figure it out that it would be popular.
Yeah.
And it was.
Did the success scare you, Garry, at all? Did this, like, you know, was there, scare is the wrong word, like, you know, like, kind of things can get away from you. You kind of go, Jesus, what the hell is happening now?
No, not really. Because first of all, it wasn't as compressed as it may have seemed. I mean, it was a hit in Galway. Then we had done a co-production with the court, with the Royal Court. I was associate director there as well at the time. And so that it was very fortunate in that respect, because usually what happened in Ireland was if a play was a hit in Dublin or Galway or whatever, by the time it was recognised as being a hit and it got to, say, London or whatever, it's usually 6 months, a year, 2 years. The original cast would have broken up. all sorts of things would have happened. Would get lost along the way. But
Yeah.
because this was a co-production, we premiered in Galway for 2 weeks and then moved straight into the Royal Court upstairs, and it premiered in London, where it got reviews, like 50, 60 reviews on the opening night, almost all of them unanimously favourable. So it became a thing very quickly because of that particular arrangement of production.
And then entering the other institution of Broadway, that must have been a wild experience, was it?
That was wild. That really was wild, and it took quite a long time to put it together, and particularly to put it together on the basis that we were retaining the original cast, because and it was a very it was a very nerve-wracking time, because after the success in London at the Royal Court, absolutely every producer on Broadway wanted it, but they all wanted it with an American cast. And luckily, we had the rights for a particular time, and so I was able to say, no, the Druid production is not going to be recast. If it's the Druid production, it's going to be done with this cast, because I knew, it was clear as day to me, that if you replaced any of those people, the play was going to lose something extraordinarily essential. Not because there's only one actor for any one role, there never is. But this play was a very strange animal, and it had to have, in order to establish its credentials as a piece of theatre, it had to have, in its original presentation, it's Irish company. It went on to have, hundreds of productions with successful productions, and all Martin's work has. But at that time, with a new writer, I think that was very important.
And that kind of, as I said, kind of talking about growing up by the Abbey and kind of other things. That side of being an artistic director or a producer kind of takes, that's where the steel comes in too. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like going, but behind that, as you say, it's also nerve-wracking, because you're kind of going, what are the bombs? What?
Yeah, it was, and it was nerve-wracking, and I think that's pretty sure that we, while there was a lot of interest, that I was pretty sure we wouldn't get to Broadway, and probably indeed we wouldn't have, if only a certain amount of things fell in our favor. Just even the process that certainly I didn't think of at the time, and nobody thinks of, you have to fall lucky in getting the real estate. You have to find a theatre that's suitable, that's available. And, I remember it was the closing of the Cape Man, the musical The Cape Man, that a series of sort of moves made the water car available, and we suddenly got to Broadway.
And then you standing on that stage receiving an award. What an extraordinary thing, and I think obviously, awards are awards and they're fantastic, but also that award particularly, and for the work, that you had done with the company over the years, and also for what you were about and you as an individual. I think it was kind of, it meant a huge amount of people. Did it resonate with you at the time, Garry, kind of going, or was it all a bit of a blur?
It did resonate with me at the time, but it didn't in the beginning. I remember, we opened in February downtown with the Atlantic, and then more or less moved almost straight away, 4 to 6 weeks. Then the Tony Awards were in June, and so everybody was talking about, you're likely to get Tony nominations, and then somebody said, if you won, you'd be the first woman, and I knew something about the Tony, but not much. And so it was only actually being there over the few months in the run-up that you began to realize the value of it. Before that, I wouldn't have. But it was special, and it was great. It was great for the play. Well, it was, everything that comes to you comes with something missing. What was extraordinary is that we all got nominated. All 4 actors got nominated, and I did as director, and of course Martin did. But then when it came down, we won. Breen O'Byrne and Tom Murphy, the late great Tom Murphy, were nominated for the same award. So only one of them could win it. Tom Murphy did. So we got 3 out of the 4 we could have on the acting. I got the directing, but then Martin did not get the writer. And however, about maybe 2-3 years later, he got the Oscar.
Yeah.
So he just said, well, who wanted a Tony anyhow? An Oscar, the only thing to have.
But come here, for you as well then, kind of, you know, coming back to Drew and coming back to Galway after that, but also, you know, you started to do quite a lot of work outside, you know, quite a lot of work kind of internationally, obviously with different companies, but like from over the last, say, 20 years of Druid, what has stood out, and not necessarily in individual plays, but has been the Druid cycles, you know, like the things like the Murphy, Shakespeare, and now recently kind of Gregory.
Yeah.
But, and also the real naming of, you know, the Druid gang, or, you know what I mean, the kind of, the associate artists. And I suppose with Druid Singh, what possessed you? You know, what?
Well, I do actually. I mean, first of all, Druid Singh was in the making for a long time, 3, 4, 5 years, being discussed actually at board level.
Yeah.
And trying to work things so that we could get enough money together, and eventually having to do a production of Playboy up front in order to cash flow it. It came out of the passion for Singh, and it came out of the fact that Singh had only 6 plays and that you could do all his plays. And it came out of what would it be like? What would happen if you did all of the plays as a company? And so that it was Druid Singh that started it. And I remember one particular thing, that when I went to Tom and said, Tom, you know, Singh and all that kind of thing, you know, I think it would be fantastic if we put together 3 of your plays. And I have ideas, actually 4, I said to him first. And I have ideas about what those plays might be. Will you talk to me about it? And he said, I will, but on one condition only. And I said, what's that? And he said that it's not called Druid Murphy. And I said, well, Tom, I burst out laughing. I said, Druid Murphy, who would ever call anything by such a name? Of course that won't happen. And 6 months later, it was called Druid Murphy. So,
was there, I mean, it must have been incredible. I mean, like for you as an artist, you know, 30 years kind of later, I mean, those rehearsal rooms must have been echoing for you, you know, in Druid Singh and Druid Murphy particularly, kind of around. Yeah. And was there, because the productions were magic, but I think the whole idea of them being done collectively as well, that you knew there was a broader universe, brings a whole different thing to it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it does, and it gives everybody. I mean, if one of the brilliant things about a rehearsal process in the theatre is the sense of a shared ambition, and you know, I mean, I hate the word, but you do make a family of a kind for that period of time, and if the good things of that are good, you can imagine how much better they are if you're spending longer time, and the bar is raised. You know, it's. So yeah, they were very special. And I think the other thing which we didn't anticipate, but became very true, is that the audience shared the experience as well. That, you know, whether you actually liked it or not, or enjoy it or not, the fact that you spend 6 hours in a theatre together with the same audience and the same bunch of actors does create a bond.
But I mean, the pressure though from, you know, in all the cast and ensemble, but, you know, in relation to yourself.
Yeah. You
mentioned there a while back about kind of, you know, conversations in the homecoming, and the last week was where the production, because of the precision and the pace. That's fine when you're talking about 1-2 hours or 1 hour and a half, but we are talking about 6-7 hours of, do you know what I mean? We take them all as a whole. That must be extraordinarily. I mean, is it about kind of keeping them separate? Completely in your head? I mean, I know the styles were different, you know, or was it them all? No, okay.
No, I mean, it is actually, I mean, there are different ways of rehearsing them. I rehearse them in different ways. and you know, you ought to set off with a plan that you'll be strictly this, that, and the other, but you don't. And you know, it's always like every production is, it's a series of accidents and good fortune. But I do remember the stakes feeling very, 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 very high for Druid Singh, because essentially the only way we could do it is effectively it was going to be our work for the year. So if it didn't work, and if it didn't attract subsequent performances outside of its original run in Galway, or whatever the original produced run was, we were going to be left with a very bare cupboard for quite a while. So yeah, it was.
But I think as well, the journey of that piece of work, the whole piece of work, you know, from Galway to like Edinburgh, New York, Inishmaan.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, I know reviews are reviews, but you kind of go to Charles Isherwood in the New York Times, you know, stating that it's theatre going experience of his life. I mean, that, you know, that has to resonate.
It could be read in two ways, you know, but anyhow.
Yeah, no, I think he meant it in the positive way.
No, he did.
But I suppose if you map out that, you know, I think it's 2005, but if you map out that sense of like New York, Inishmaan, that was still there from like the mid 80s or like the mid 70s even.
Yeah.
You know, that's absolutely amazing back at that stage. But even now, 15 years later, that those islands and those villages are your kind of as much in the international space, you know, as New York is. But I suppose when you went on then and kind of went, okay, we've done this, and then we do Tom Murphy's, it's a very different beast, obviously, and very different explorations of the Irish psyche. But putting them up side by side, I mean, what did you discover yourself, Garry, in relation to the Tom Murphys?
Well, again, you know, the kind of, again, the root of each project is quite different, even though they may eventually, you know, feel like they're the same. But Druid Singh came out of, wouldn't it be great to see all of his plays together? Because there's one play that everybody knows, or two plays, Riders to See and Playboy. Most people don't know anything of the other plays. So that's what kind of drove that.
Yeah.
Then with Murphy, the realization that other countries had national epics, if you like.
Yes.
You know, particularly England has Shakespeare, but we didn't. And then knowing or developing the thought in my head that, but we do, in the plays of Tom Murphy, we actually have, if you look at his plays from his very first play, which we produced this year, to his very last play, it's a national narrative that's been created there. And so that was the instinct to see, could we do that, you know, to work with him on doing that.
Yeah. And did you find, like, you know, obviously having done the plays before, but like when you kind of do them in that kind of ensemble, did you find through that excavation something, you know, and I don't mean unique about them all, but that kind of sense of that underbelly of that national question there?
Oh, you absolutely did. But that too had been very informed with the relationship with Murphy. I mean, having done his plays prior to that, we knew, for instance, that Famine was not a history play. It was more a history. It was more a play about the Irish psyche that Tom himself was trying to understand. And that sort of informed the fact that we could actually take something that looked like it had a historical sequence.
Yeah.
And it did, in a way, in the sense that it was the history of Tom's life, but not necessarily an actual history of Ireland. But all those kind of things helped to create the ideas behind the cycle.
And then, I mean, you mentioned the writer yourself, but kind of having, you know, talked about, you know, Britain or England and kind of Shakespeare, and then, so that kind of journey towards doing, how did that kind of, it was a seminal moment where that began for you, that kind of, of Druid Shakespeare, of the Shakespeare?
No, the Druid Shakespeare like came out of kind of, Druid had never done Shakespeare. We did a production very early on of, forgetting the title, but it was very early on. And I truly, I would say I was scared of Shakespeare. And then gradually, as we did Druid Sing and Druid Murphy, you know, a certain inevitability of discussion began to happen. Now, not me, but in the company and in the company of actors. And it just became something that was being talked about. And eventually we sort of made a decision that the resources were there for us at least to be able to think about and contemplate such a project. So Druid Shakespeare came out of the rest. Druid Shakespeare would never have happened without Druid Sing, etc.
And was there the choices then around which ones? Like, was there, you know, in relation to when you're choosing to do Shakespeare, the choices around which plays?
Yeah.
Was that?
Yeah, I think there was a deliberate choice, or certainly a deliberate feeling from me that the history of the history plays, because the history plays presented me with a kind of narrative scope, a narrative line that I felt I could hold on to as I directed the plays.
Yeah, and that very much was there, or is there, you know, and I think that, but the whole sense of it, what I loved about them was the fact that there was no excuses made about where they were from. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's sometimes, you know, when you see people trying not to do Shakespeare in Shakespearean language, they actually end up doing it, you know, in a kind of Shakespearean mid-Atlantic, whatever, you know. But I mean,
absolutely. Well, it was it was part of my thinking, and very much that I used to be jealous of the fact that we shared a language with the language that the plays were written in. I used to long that if we could be German, we could do our own Shakespeare. But because we lived so close, and the Shakespeare that was available to us was, you know, the fictional history, if you like, but it was notionally the narrative of that country, then how do you actually do that in Ireland when your position in the world as a colony was so entirely different than how the plays were originally written and performed?
Yeah,
so that became part of the kind of grit of it, if you like.
Yeah, because then you're kind of nearly, I mean, I'm using this word sparingly, but you're kind of deconstructing them as you're kind of going in
exactly. Yeah. You have to in some way, because otherwise you say, why am I doing these plays? If we can't as a company find some sort of reason that we are doing these plays in this particular way at this particular time in this place, then we shouldn't be doing them at all. Yeah. So that was kind of a rod for our backs that was useful, I think.
Yeah. And then the presence of soil. I mean, I'm fascinated by the kind of, for me, the kind of the soil, or kind of harks back nearly the kind of the same, that kind of sense of and I'd say Koji huge sweeping problems, or finding a ficking out everywhere for years afterwards. But that sense of the earth was seismically there, not only in the stage design, but just in the way it was seemed to have kind of grown.
Well, I mean, again, this is the thing. This is when you have a history, you can use it, so to speak. So, like when we came to do the Shakespeare plays, and you're trying to find reasons why you're doing it or how you're doing it, it just became a very quick conversation between myself and Francis to say, well, let's use the Druid earth. Let's use the soil again, and that somehow literally seemed a safe place to start. So, and like even from a technical point of view, we knew how to handle it, we knew how to get it, we knew how to keep it moist, all of that kind of thing. And so, eventually good ideas come out of kind of obvious things sometimes, and just very practical things.
And then I suppose you mentioned Francis there. I mean, out of that time has grown, an ensemble of actors, but also a kind of an association with people,
creative associates, Francis, David Bolger, various, it's fabulous to be able to have relationships with multiple people, that you have an ongoing conversation that's not just limited to the first day of rehearsal and the last day of the last performance, that it continues.
And then they come to you wanting to do Waiting for Godot.
And then they come to you, want to do Waiting for Godot, and you say, I have no intention, absolutely not doing that play. And then gradually they wear you down and you eventually do it, and they were right.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary production, and I think the one of the things that really struck me was the age of the protagonist, brought a whole new kind of dimension of a life not yet lived, rather than a kind of but also your choice as well. In that's what I love about your work, is the choice, the presentation of it in a site specific way becomes. And I don't necessarily purely mean that in relation to how it reflects against the landscape, but like back from your early days about going to kind of, Loughrea and Tuam, and kind of going that started to become, an aesthetic choice as well, say for Godot, which played, out in the fields.
Absolutely. And at the time when we looked for permission to play it outdoors, in fact, the estate was not very happy and was dubious about it. And I kind of understood why, because, Beckett had constructed an entirely artificial, consciously theatrical space. And that when you then went and put them into a natural space, well, was there something being lost? So I kind of understood his reluctance initially, but I think there was something special with them in the landscape as well.
So then I suppose then in recent years there's been, most recently, we'll get to Drew Gregory in a minute, but there's Richard III and the Cherry Orchard, which got kiboshed, I suppose the very beginning of its run. But in relation to
it wasn't actually, it was the end of its run in Galway, and also we got it the televised version in as well. So in a way, we were quite lucky. I mean, people got far more kiboshed than we did, but we were due to go to Edinburgh and various other things like that. So yeah, it did get.
But again, it's testament to the world that we're kind of unfortunately living through at the moment, where you're right. Some things, at least you got it to the stage. Some things never got up off the ground.
Yeah.
But in relation to Richard, again, I think that was an extraordinary piece of work, and not just, as I say, for Erin's amazing performance, but also the way an awful lot of things I think seem to kind of collide into there. But again, that after doing, say, all the Shakespeare's, so not all Shakespeare's, but the history plays, was there a sense of, oh great, I'm just doing one? Was there a sense of
yeah. Well, there was a little bit, but then when you do the one that's called Richard III, you're sort of, I mean, it's huge. And, but it was always, I always sort of loved it as a play. So it was great to have the opportunity to do it, and then to have the opportunity to do it with a company that for the most part had worked, I'd worked with before and on Shakespeare, and then to have somebody like Erin to be Richard. I mean, that's the bliss of an ensemble, that you can turn around and you can have luxury right through your casting. You can have great actors playing lead roles, and you have great actors playing not necessarily lead roles, and they feed in and out of each other, and one piece of work feeds into the other piece of work. I mean, it does generally for people working together. In a sense, there's almost kind of an Irish ensemble, a group of people who work between the major theatres. But you can actually, with something like Druid and having a group of actors who work together over a period of years consciously as an ensemble, you can actually use that in a way that I think we've all found can give a richness over and above what you you might normally be able to
And is
achieve.
that something, I mean, you said in a career that you never expected to have, or you expected to have of this kind of, you know, length. Is that,
Yeah.
in relation to it being kind of, I suppose, hewn or born anew for you each time, like, because there's a freshness still to your work, into Druid's work, which is not to be sniffed at. Do you know what I mean? I'm not, you know,
Yeah.
I'm not being facetious about that, because, you know, it's a long period of kind of time. But, and what is there in particular you put that down to Garry?
Well, I mean, I think that's, as I said, I think that's down to the gifts that working in a consistent way with a consistent bunch of people, whether they be the current ensemble or the ensembles, for instance, that gathered around the Martin McDonagh's, to be able to have that kind. I mean, it isn't necessarily any easier, because, you know, you're fighting for an Arts Council grant, you're fighting for this, you know, you're scared of the future, like everybody is, but it does allow you to have a, I don't know, there's benefits to having a joint history with a large group of people that you can refer to and help support you. And then the other side of it is you can bore each other, or, you know, be bored by each other, or take advantage, or not work as hard as you should, or whatever. But I would say that the benefits are great.
Yeah, and but then as well, I suppose in the last 20 years, as you've kind of been developing the company as well, I mean, you know, the whole idea of new writing and the whole debut series, and the whole, you know, that has been, you know, both from an industry point of view, and as I said, I was kind of blessed to direct one of them 20 years ago, God help me. But the that has become a big part of it, you know, and that, I just say, kind of, you know, eking out new relationships and new writers, and kind of that sense of, and also bringing in other directors, other, you know, and
that has to be part of it. I mean, you do, you know, you do realize that you're you know, that, you know, whatever Druid is in 10 years time, it's not going to be the Druid that's here now or was here yesterday, and that you have to provide for the future, because the future's coming no matter what. And you also have to try and give to younger people give back some of the things that you got, that one, you know, you have to, because it's somebody who is back there now writing plays that, or it's people that we've never heard of, that are going to matter in 10 or 15 years time. So, you know,
in grappling with that, and grappling with the times that we live in, and, you know, and in grappling with, you know, a woman that's right back at the dawn of kind of, you know, our national theatre, and also, you know, the choice then to do Druid Gregory, and God, were you like Lear in the storm, you know, hoping that things fell on different days between COVID and restrictions and
oh, completely. And we really, honestly, we really got lucky. I mean, there's no question about it. I mean, the Lady Gregory was, her plays were part of an original, bigger, longer project before COVID ever happened. And then the Lady Gregory Cool thing developed really out of that project, plus the specifics of the difficulties having to perform outside and wanting to get back to live audiences. But, you know, it proved wonderful, because Lady Gregory was always somebody I thought I knew, but until actually sort of, you know, given the opportunity of time, like the original lockdown gave us, actually getting to know her properly and reading a lot of her own work and so on, it, you know, it was really interesting to look at her life and look at her achievements in some sort of detail, rather than as this, as I said, you know, black and white photograph of this Lady Gregory that everybody was terrified of, and so on, you know. So she was an extraordinary woman.
Yeah, and I'm not going to keep you much longer, but I'm interested in, we talked about, say, Tony Awards, we talked about, you know, kind of that sense of in a way gets into public-private, and like, you know, you're I suppose back in the early days, you know, and your theatre is obviously called after the great man now, but like, I mean, Mick Lally would have say got that public fame. Do you know what I mean? He would have been, and he would have been probably one of the first, not one of the first, but one of the real ones that kind of got people who knew him for years as a stage actor.
Yeah.
You know, and then Miley came out, and it was all that kind of juxtaposition. But I suppose what I'm interested in, say, from your point of view in relation to being the person that would have been like a director is more behind the scenes necessarily, but then when you go and become a director of the National Theatre, when you end up winning Tony Awards, like, how do you balance that kind of public persona and a private? Is that something that's hard for you, or is that something that you've kind of?
No, I don't think it is, because I don't think I have the kind of fame that, say, Mick had as Miley, where he became a sort of a national figure, you know. You know, and also Mick as well. I mean, I always say about Mick, Mick was actually famous long before he ever became Miley. He was famous in Galway here when he came into the good and so on. So I don't have the kind of public, you can see people looking at you sometimes and you feel like reassuring them, and no, you don't know me, you just think you know me. That's, I have many problems, but problems of fame is not one of them.
No, but I suppose I suppose more so in relation to, say, when you get asked to kind of speak out things or speak upon, or like, that's something that kind of you kind of go, no, grand, thanks, or I'm kind of fine, I'm doing this, or, you know.
Well, I am aware. I am aware between of the difference between the public voice and the private voice. That I can voice opinions privately that would be very different if I voiced them publicly.
Yes.
And I try to some extent, and it has, I think, in my life been a bit of a balancing act between using that public voice, but being able to retain the privacy that I need in order to simply do the work I do.
Yeah, I get you. And finally, I'm just kind of interested in, like, as we're now, as you said, the future is kind of ahead of us, but I'm fascinated, like, you know, you've kind of that long relationship with Marie, and the sense of, like, actually, you know, the present relationship with her. But is there, like, do you look back a lot? Do you find yourself? Yeah.
Oh, look, I mean, we have good fun. I mean, I remember when we were much younger, when we'd find people telling stories about what happened 10 years ago and what happened in this. And we said, we will never be caught like this. We would never tell stories about the old days and blah, 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 to find ourselves doing exactly that. So, yeah, you know, you've grown up to be the kind of people that we would have run a million miles away from 30 or 40 years ago. So
yeah, well, I think we're all destined to become that.
I think that's true. Yeah.
Listen, Garry, thanks so much for taking part in this and giving me so much time. It's been an absolute joy, and thanks also for your work over the years, and can't wait to see more of it into the future. The one question I meant to ask you: how do you feel about your bust in the National Gallery? That's incredible. But
it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. I still can't quite get used to it, to be honest.
Yeah.
But you know, it's amazing that people have to, because most people don't know it's there,
right,
and tend to stumble on it accidentally. And I've just finished quickly with a story of a friend of mine that I went to school with in Monaghan. I hadn't seen her since I left primary school in Monaghan, and she got in touch with me, and she said she had always down the years threatened to get in touch with me, and it was only when she lives in England, it was only when she came across the Boston National Gallery, she said, I have to see what she looks like now. So yeah, I it's just there. It's kind of, you know, it was a fact. She's an extraordinary artist, and it was a bit of a privilege to have to sit for it. But when I look at it myself, I just.
And does finish off now to kind of mention yourself again? But did Monaghan play a big part in like, was that kind of like, you know, do you still hold? Is that art still there for you? You know, is Cabinet Country still that kind of still?
Yeah, I know it, but not no. The country that's still there for me is the west of Ireland, is Ballymun,
Yeah.
where I was born and where I spent the first 6, 7 years of my life. That's the country of my imagination. Monaghan I remember, but it was in between things.
Yeah.
It was in between Ballymun and Roscommon, and then coming to Galway. So it doesn't have quite the same resonance.
Yeah, yeah. Garry,
As,
thanks so much for doing this, and I look forward to seeing you in the flesh again soon, and also see your work on stage again soon. Hopefully, when we can all get out from away from our Zooms.
Exactly. God.
Yeah.
Listen, thanks very much.
No worries.
Thanks.